The life of a medieval assassin has often been romanticized. We imagine figures cloaked in shadows, wielding daggers with precision, executing their targets with deadly accuracy. But the reality of an assassin's life was far more mundane, filled with uncertainty, fear, and an overwhelming sense of invisibility. The medieval world was a land of constant turmoil, with power struggles between kingdoms, religions, and wealthy landowners. Assassins were not always the cold-hearted killers we picture in movies. Many were former soldiers, mercenaries, or peasants who found themselves in the dangerous business of assassination for one reason: survival. In this section, we begin by examining the origins of the medieval assassin. Unlike the shadowy figures we imagine, these individuals were more often thrust into their roles by circumstance than by choice. Many came from lower classes, their lives marked by poverty and a lack of opportunity. They were trained in the arts of war and assassination not by a grand mentor or in lavish hidden temples, but through necessity, often learning their deadly skills from older men who had long been part of the mercenary world. One of the earliest mentions of an organized group of assassins comes from the medieval Middle East, the Nizari Ismailis, often known as the Assassins. These individuals were well trained in stealth and guerrilla tactics, striking at the heart of political and religious figures. But the term assassin in the European context carried a different meaning. It wasn't just about clandestine killings for political reasons. It was a means of survival in a harsh and unstable world. The training of an assassin was grueling and not as glamorous as one might imagine. Training often involved learning how to move through the shadows, use various weapons, and gather intelligence, skills that would keep them alive in a world where death was always just a breath away. But it wasn't just about the physical act of killing. Assassins were often required to live a life of secrecy, hiding their true identities from friends, family, and allies. The life of an assassin wasn't a glamorous one. They lived on the edge, constantly looking over their shoulders, never able to settle into a place of comfort. Even when they succeeded in a mission, they knew they were never far from the blade themselves. And often, assassins were not the ones in control of their fate. They were hired, used, and discarded like pawns in a much larger political game. But why did these individuals choose such a dangerous and miserable life? What drove them to put everything at risk? Was it truly for wealth, or was it a result of a desperate attempt to escape poverty and hopelessness? Assassins in the medieval period didn't have the luxury of working under the cover of night or in quiet, secretive hideouts. Their work was more complex than just silent kills. It was about constantly maintaining a dangerous balance of survival. They often faced betrayal, poverty, and the overwhelming fear of being hunted down by those who hired them, or by the very people they sought to eliminate. The actual tasks of a medieval assassin were much less dramatic than one might assume. For example, many assassination attempts were not about the elegance of a clean kill, but rather about the art of making a message or sending a political warning. The target was often a leader, a king, or a religious figure who had created enemies due to their policies, and an assassin was the messenger. In many cases, these killers had to wait patiently for days, months, or even years to strike. Stealth, patience, and timing were crucial traits that were developed through harsh, constant training. One of the most notable challenges faced by assassins was not just avoiding detection from their enemies, but living in a constant state of distrust. Many times, they were forced to live in places where they were hated or feared, where their profession was not only dangerous but openly despised. In Europe, an assassin was typically seen as a coward or a mercenary, someone without honor or integrity. For an assassin to succeed, they had to be more than just good at using weapons. They needed to understand the politics of their time, the motivations behind their targets, and the intricacies of the court systems. Every assassination was a game of chance. For every successful kill, there were countless botched attempts, where the assassin would narrowly escape with their life or fail in their mission altogether. Most assassins were not solitary figures. They often worked in small groups or factions, part of larger mercenary bands or organizations. Some were hired by influential families to eliminate rivals or traitors. Others were members of secret societies with far-reaching political motives. Whether they were working for personal gain or on behalf of a political faction, their lives were filled with uncertainty and constant danger. Despite the apparent glamour often attributed to assassins in popular culture, their day-to-day existence was far from glamorous. They lived in fear of being caught, betrayed, or killed. The best they could hope for was a life of anonymity. Some lived long enough to grow old and disappear from history, while others met violent ends before they could carry out their final mission. But there is one crucial question to consider. What did the life of an assassin ultimately mean? Were these individuals just pawns in the larger game of medieval politics, or did they wield real power and influence in shaping the course of history? As we reach the conclusion of the medieval assassin's tale, we must consider how the profession of assassination, although often thought of as morally corrupt or sinister, left an indelible mark on history. The reality was that medieval assassins, like all people, were products of their environment. In an era where power struggles were ruthless, kings and nobles alike employed these shadowy figures not just for assassination, but also to maintain their fragile reigns and eliminate threats to their rule. The final missions of many assassins were often the most dangerous and the most telling of the life they led. Take, for example, the final mission of one of the most famous medieval assassins, a figure known only by the moniker, the Red Blade. In the final years of his life, the assassin was tasked with eliminating a powerful duke whose influence was threatening the balance of power in the region. The Red Blade's mission was fraught with peril, not only because of the obvious risks involved, but because it would mark the end of his time as an assassin. The job was personal. He had once been betrayed by the Duke, leading him to seek revenge. But the assassination would prove to be far from a straightforward task. For weeks, the Red Blade observed the Duke, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He spent countless hours hiding in plain sight, slipping through the shadows and making use of his knowledge of the land. But in the end, it wasn't a surprise attack or a skillfully executed blow that led to his success. Instead, the Duke's guards, informed of the impending threat, turned against him. The Red Blade found himself trapped in a world of shifting alliances and political treachery. unable to escape the very forces he had once employed. But what does this story tell us about the life of a medieval assassin? It isn't simply about the act of murder. It's about how these individuals navigated a world that constantly sought to crush them underfoot. They were pawns, but also agents of change. Their final moments were often defined by betrayal, not only by the enemies they killed, but by the systems they worked for. As we reflect on the legacy of medieval assassins, it becomes clear that they were not mere killers. They were the unfortunate victims of a world defined by political instability, where power and survival were always in constant flux. Assassins had no place in the courts or in history books, but their actions were nonetheless pivotal in shaping the course of medieval politics. Their lives were fleeting, their deaths often untold, and their stories overshadowed by the figures of kings and generals. But in truth, they were no less important to the medieval world than those they sought to eliminate. In the end, the medieval assassin's life was not one of glory, but one of silent endurance. It wasn't a life filled with riches or honor, but rather a ceaseless struggle to stay alive in a world that cared little for the lives of common men. Yet, through their work, assassins left their marks on history, perhaps not in the way they envisioned, but certainly in ways that we can still observe in the intricate political landscapes of the past. So, as you lie there, drifting into sleep, think about the hidden figures in history, the ones whose names may never have been recorded, whose stories remain untold. What does their silence teach us about the power dynamics that shape the world we live in today? Perhaps the true measure of an assassin's life isn't in their final mission, but in the moments of anonymity and reflection that followed it. Feudal agriculture, often viewed through the lens of grand castles and heroic knights, was in truth a laborious and grueling existence for the vast majority of medieval people. When we think of the Middle Ages, we envision kings and queens, battles, and gallant knights. But for the majority of people, especially peasants, life was much less glamorous. The heart of medieval society was its agricultural system. The vast majority of people lived in small villages or rural areas, working the land as part of the feudal system. They were bound by contracts with lords who owned the land, and in return for the land they cultivated, peasants gave a portion of their crops as rent. Life in the fields was harsh, and the work was backbreaking, often beginning at dawn and continuing until sunset. The peasant's role in medieval agriculture was not just one of physical labor. It was about survival. Every decision made on the farm could mean the difference between life and death. Farmers had to contend with unpredictable weather, pests, and diseases that could wipe out entire crops. A poor harvest could lead to hunger, poverty, and even death. Yet, despite these challenges, peasants were integral to the medieval economy. Without their labor, the castles and courts would have no food, and the kings and queens would have no means of sustaining their armies. The majority of medieval peasants were serfs, bound to the land and owned by their lords. They did not have the luxury of free choice. They could not leave the land they worked on, nor could they marry without their lord's permission. Their lives were dictated by the seasons and the needs of the land. They lived in small, rudimentary houses made of wood and straw, often sharing their homes with animals. There was no comfort, no luxury, only the barest necessities for survival. One of the most difficult aspects of life for peasants was the unrelenting demands of the seasons. The growing season was short, and during that time, peasants worked tirelessly to ensure that the crops grew and were harvested. In the winter, life was equally difficult. The cold months were spent repairing tools, preparing for the next planting season, and in some cases, trying to survive on what little was left from the previous harvest. The work itself was grueling. Plowing the fields, sowing seeds, and reaping the harvest all required physical strength and endurance. For most peasants, this meant working from sunup to sundown with only brief periods for rest. Farming was done by hand, with rudimentary tools that could hardly be called efficient by modern standards. The plow, for example, was often a simple wooden device that required considerable effort to push through the soil. Yet despite all the hardships, the peasants had to find ways to survive. They developed strategies for managing the land and making the most of their limited resources. Crop rotation, for instance, was a technique that allowed peasants to keep the soil fertile and ensure a steady food supply. They also learned how to breed animals and cultivate gardens for food, relying heavily on what they grew or raised themselves. But the question remains, was there any escape from this cycle of labor? Or were medieval peasants doomed to spend their entire lives working the land under the harsh rule of feudal lords? As the peasants' day-to-day life was marked by struggle, it was equally defined by their dependence on the feudal system. This system was built on mutual obligations. Peasants worked the land and in return received protection and the right to live on the land they worked. However, this arrangement was often far from equal. The lords, who owned the land, had the power to extract as much as they could from the peasants, leaving little for them to survive on after they paid their rent. One of the most burdensome aspects of this system was the taxes and rents that peasants had to pay to their lords. These were often paid in kind, meaning that a portion of the harvest, whether grain, livestock, or other produce, went directly to the lord. If the harvest was poor or if there were unexpected costs, peasants were often unable to meet these demands. This left them vulnerable to punishment, or, in the worst case, being evicted from the land they had worked for generations. Feudal obligations didn't end with rent payments. Peasants also owed labor to their lords. This labor could take many forms, working on the lord's private fields, repairing his roads, or providing other services deemed necessary by the lord. This meant that peasants didn't just have their own fields to tend. They also had to set aside time to work for their lord, often without compensation. While peasants were expected to produce enough for their families, any surplus went straight into the hands of the lord. As a result, many peasants lived in a constant state of indebtedness. But it wasn't just taxes and labor obligations that made life in the field so difficult. The unpredictability of weather played a huge role in the peasants' fate. Harvests could fail due to droughts, excessive rainfall, or even the wrong kind of pests. Unlike modern agriculture, which has the benefit of advanced weather forecasting and irrigation techniques, medieval peasants had to rely on their experience and luck. If the weather didn't cooperate, the consequences could be dire. Starvation, disease, and death were constant threats, and the entire community could suffer if the harvest failed. The impact of these constant struggles on the psyche of medieval peasants was profound. While the nobility could look forward to feasts, festivals, and comfortable lives, the peasants lived in a constant state of anxiety about survival. They were tethered to the land, with few opportunities for escape. Their lives were dictated not just by the seasons, but by the whims of their lords and the unpredictable forces of nature. Yet, even within this grim existence, there were moments of quiet rebellion. Though rarely written about, peasants did occasionally resist. Small revolts, uprisings, and protests occurred across Europe. These were often driven by the oppressive demands placed on peasants, particularly when lords raised rents or increased their obligations. However, these uprisings were not usually successful, as peasants had no real military power and were often crushed by the very forces that had long controlled them. Nevertheless, the existence of such uprisings reveals a simmering dissatisfaction and desire for change among the peasant class. But even as they struggled, peasants were not alone in their fight. They had each other, their families, their neighbors, and their fellow villagers. Together, they developed coping strategies that allowed them to survive despite the odds. But were these occasional uprisings enough to change the oppressive system of feudalism? Or did the peasants remain forever caught in the cycle of labor and dependence? The legacy of feudal agriculture is one marked by hardship, resilience, and slow change. While the medieval peasant class did not live to see the complete dismantling of the feudal system, their efforts to survive and adapt to their harsh environment laid the groundwork for the eventual transformations that would come in later centuries. The peasants' struggles did not go entirely unnoticed. Over time, some monarchs, like England's King Henry II, began to implement reforms aimed at curbing some of the more exploitative aspects of feudalism. For example, the introduction of common law and a more standardized system of taxation helped mitigate the arbitrary demands of lords. However, these changes were slow and often resisted by the entrenched nobility, who still held significant power over the peasantry. But beyond the legal reforms, the most significant shifts came from the peasants themselves. Though they were constantly oppressed, peasants were innovative. The slow development of new agricultural techniques, like crop rotation and better plowing methods, helped ensure that land was used more efficiently and could withstand the pressures of medieval life. The introduction of the heavy plow, for example, allowed for deeper soil cultivation and more fertile land, leading to more successful harvests. These innovations, though small, had long-lasting effects that extended beyond the medieval period. By the end of the medieval era, shifts in population, the rise of commerce, and the decline of feudalism began to chip away at the rigid structure that had held peasants in place for centuries. The Black Death, though devastating in the short term, led to a dramatic shortage of labor. With fewer people available to work the land, wages began to rise and peasants found themselves in higher demand. This shift allowed for greater mobility and opportunities, though it didn't eliminate the struggles peasants faced. Over the course of the next several centuries, many peasants began to see improvements in their quality of life. The medieval agricultural system, with all its hardships, eventually gave way to the rise of modern farming practices and an emerging middle class. But the influence of the peasant's life would remain, not just in agriculture, but in the broader societal structure. Feudalism may have faded, but the lessons learned from centuries of survival in the fields, how to persevere through difficulty, how to find strength in community, and how to adapt to ever-changing circumstances, echoed through future generations. As we reflect on the lives of these medieval peasants, we are reminded of the resilience of those who lived at the margins of history. Their struggles were often invisible, but their contributions were no less significant. They were the backbone of medieval society, and while their stories were seldom told, the world they shaped is still with us today. So what can we learn from the lives of these long-forgotten individuals? Their survival strategies, their quiet acts of resistance, and their ability to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds offer a valuable lesson that even in the most oppressive and difficult circumstances, human perseverance can lead to change. Perhaps the true story of medieval agriculture isn't one of suffering, but one of enduring strength. The Black Death is one of the most infamous and devastating pandemics in history, but the story of how it affected medieval society is far more complex and multifaceted than many realize. It wasn't just a disease that spread rapidly across Europe. It was a harrowing reality that reshaped the lives of millions, altering the course of history in ways that are still felt today. In the year 1347, the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, began to spread from the port cities of the Mediterranean. Ships carrying goods and unknowingly infected rats and fleas arrived on the shores of Europe, setting in motion a disaster that would decimate the population. By 1351, it was estimated that nearly one-third of Europe's population had perished, an unprecedented loss of life that forever changed the social, economic, and cultural fabric of the medieval world. At the time, people had no understanding of bacteria or viruses. The plague was thought to be a divine punishment or a curse, and those who contracted it often faced a grim fate. The symptoms were terrifying: fever, chills, vomiting, and swollen lymph nodes, often referred to as buboes. These grotesque growths would appear on the neck, armpits, or groin, and they were usually followed by the rapid onset of death. Mortality rates were shockingly high, and entire families could be wiped out in a matter of days. The daily life of those living during the Black Death was marked by an overwhelming sense of fear and confusion. Once the plague began to spread through towns and villages, the victims were often abandoned by their neighbors. People fled their homes, leaving behind loved ones and possessions, desperate to escape the invisible enemy. In cities, the streets became eerily quiet as homes were boarded up and trade came to a halt. The very concept of community, which had been a fundamental part of medieval life, began to disintegrate. But while the upper classes could afford to flee, the peasants and lower classes had nowhere to go. They were left to endure the horrors of the plague, working the fields while the sickness spread through their villages. And as much as the people feared for their lives, they had to continue the daily grind of survival. For many, this meant working long hours with little rest and barely enough food to sustain themselves. For those who survived, the impact of the Black Death on their daily lives was lasting, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. It wasn't just the disease that devastated medieval society. It was the collapse of everyday life. The fear of contamination was ever present, and even the simple acts of socializing, going to church, or gathering for food became fraught with anxiety. People began to avoid contact with others as much as possible, adopting extreme measures like wearing protective clothing, burning clothes, and even using fire to try and purify the air. So how did these individuals, so trapped in their daily existence, endure such overwhelming loss? Was there any way to make sense of the chaos, or did they simply succumb to the unrelenting tide of death? The terror of the Black Death wasn't just about the disease itself. It was about the collapse of the social order and the brutal realities of survival when everything around you was falling apart. In the wake of the plague, the world seemed to be coming to an end. As towns and villages were ravaged by the disease, entire communities were left in shambles. It was a world where the dead outnumbered the living, where the streets were filled with the stench of death, and where the survivors had to grapple with an overwhelming fear of what might come next. For the survivors, the reality of the Black Death was one of constant struggle. They had to find ways to continue their daily lives in a world that no longer made sense. In the countryside, agricultural labor continued, despite the absence of many of the workers. Peasants who had once been part of a community now found themselves isolated, forced to fend for themselves. The fields still had to be tended, crops still had to be harvested, and livestock still needed care. But with the death of so many, there was no one left to work the land. In cities, the situation was even more dire. Without sufficient manpower, commerce came to a halt. Shops closed, markets emptied, and the once bustling streets became eerily silent. The wealthy, who had the resources to flee to rural estates or even abroad, were not immune from the plague, but their ability to retreat to safe havens meant they were more likely to survive. Meanwhile, the urban poor, left behind in their overcrowded and unsanitary homes, faced the brunt of the plague's deadly grip. One of the most striking aspects of life during the plague was how it revealed the vulnerability of medieval society. The plague didn't discriminate. Royalty and commoners alike fell victim to its grasp. But while the rich had the means to isolate themselves, the poor were left to endure the full force of the epidemic. Many of them, particularly those working as servants, laborers, or in the lower echelons of medieval society, had to continue working in overcrowded conditions despite the dangers. But beyond the immediate threat of death, there was the lingering fear of what the future would hold. Communities struggled to rebuild, but the trauma of losing so many people was profound. Families were torn apart, and even entire villages disappeared. The cultural impact of the plague was also significant. Religious practices and institutions, which had been an essential part of medieval life, began to lose their grip on people. Many believed the plague to be a divine punishment, and some turned to extreme religious practices in an attempt to ward off the disease, such as flagellation, where people would whip themselves in a display of repentance. But while many turned to religion for solace, others sought out alternative explanations and solutions. There were those who, fueled by panic and desperation, blamed marginalized groups such as Jews, believing that they had somehow caused the plague. This led to horrific acts of violence and persecution, as entire communities were blamed and attacked, despite no evidence to support such claims. Amidst the turmoil, some survivors found unexpected opportunities. With the massive death toll came a labor shortage, and those who survived found themselves in higher demand. Wages rose, and some peasants were able to negotiate better terms with their lords, leading to a slow shift in the balance of power between the feudal classes. This shift eventually contributed to the decline of feudalism and set the stage for the social and economic changes that would come in the centuries following the Black Death. But the question remains, how did this devastating event, which altered the course of history, shape the future of the medieval world? Was the Black Death a turning point that helped pave the way for the Renaissance, or did it simply leave an indelible scar on society? The Black Death was not just a catastrophe that wiped out a third of Europe's population. Its aftermath forever reshaped the landscape of medieval society in ways that were both immediate and lasting. As the death toll soared and the bodies of the fallen piled up, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of a broken world. One of the most immediate consequences of the Black Death was the massive labor shortage. The vast number of deaths left fields untended, crops unharvested, and villages abandoned. However, for those who survived, this shortage presented an opportunity. The feudal system, which had been the backbone of medieval society, began to crumble under the weight of the plague's toll. The demand for labor skyrocketed, and peasants and workers, previously bound by strict feudal obligations, found themselves in a position to negotiate better wages and working conditions. The peasant class, once oppressed and tied to the land, gained more mobility. Some were able to purchase land, while others moved to cities in search of better opportunities. This shift helped to weaken the traditional feudal structure, as the rigid class distinctions that had governed medieval life began to erode. The impact of the Black Death on the labor market was one of the key factors that helped set the stage for the decline of feudalism and the rise of early capitalism in the following centuries. Another significant transformation was religious. While many had turned to religion during the plague, hoping for divine intervention or solace in the face of overwhelming suffering, the plague also sparked a crisis of faith for some. The church had no answers for the disaster, and many people began to question its authority. This led to a rise in anti-clerical sentiment and a search for alternative spiritual paths. The plague's devastating impact on monasteries and religious institutions, which were often at the heart of medieval society, further weakened the church's influence. At the same time, the plague also had a profound effect on the arts and culture. The death and suffering left an indelible mark on the collective psyche, leading to a shift in artistic themes. The motif of memento mori, a reminder of death, became prevalent in the art of the time. Paintings, sculptures, and literature began to reflect the stark reality of mortality, with depictions of death and decay becoming more common. This artistic shift is often seen as one of the precursors to the later developments of the Renaissance, which was characterized by a renewed focus on humanism and the individual. The Black Death also contributed to the rise of the early modern world in less obvious ways. The economic upheaval brought about by the labor shortage led to the development of new financial practices, such as credit and banking. The rise of cities, driven by an influx of displaced rural populations, led to the growth of trade and commerce, eventually giving rise to the more complex economic systems that would shape the modern world. But despite these shifts, the trauma of the Black Death was not easily forgotten. The survivors were left to grapple with the psychological toll of having witnessed the deaths of loved ones, friends, and entire communities. The grief was profound, and for many, the sense of loss was overwhelming. Families were torn apart, and entire towns vanished, leaving only the ghosts of what once was. In many ways, the emotional scars left by the Black Death persisted long after the physical wounds had healed. The Black Death, in all its horror, was not simply a moment in time. It was a pivot point that forced medieval society to adapt and evolve. It hastened the decline of feudalism, led to significant changes in the labor market, and even reshaped the religious and cultural fabric of Europe. But at what cost? How much was lost in the wake of the plague, and how much of what emerged afterward was built on the suffering and devastation of millions? As we look back on the Black Death, it's clear that it was a turning point in history. Yet, for the survivors, the aftermath was a struggle to rebuild, to adapt, and to find meaning in a world that had been irrevocably changed. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from this time is the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. Despite the overwhelming grief, humanity pressed on, adapting, surviving, and eventually rebuilding. When we think of medieval royalty, we often envision grand castles, elaborate feasts, and lavish wardrobes. What we don't typically imagine is how these kings and queens handled their most basic needs, specifically their toilets. While we associate modern advancements with sanitation, the medieval world had a much different approach to personal hygiene and waste management, even for the most powerful rulers. For a king, or any member of the aristocracy, privacy and comfort were essential, even in something as mundane as using the toilet. However, the reality of royal toileting in the Middle Ages was far from glamorous. In castles and palaces, toilets were often little more than crude latrines, sometimes located in the most inconvenient and uncomfortable places. But these facilities, though rudimentary by today's standards, were crucial in maintaining a semblance of dignity for the nobility. Medieval toilets were usually situated in a small room called a privy. These privies were often positioned in the most discreet areas of castles or palaces, but they were still far from pleasant. The privy could be little more than a small stone chamber with a hole in the floor that emptied directly into a cesspit, or, in some cases, into a river. For royalty, this meant that even the most basic acts of privacy were conducted in rooms that could be no larger than a cramped closet. But while the toilets themselves might have been crude, the maintenance of these areas was another matter. Kings, being the rulers of vast territories, often had attendants and servants who saw to the cleanliness of their privies. In some cases, these attendants would also provide fresh water for washing, as the concept of modern-day plumbing did not exist. In certain castles, toilets were even connected to a system of drains that would carry waste out of the castle into nearby ditches, though these systems were far from reliable. Despite these facilities, many kings were still forced to endure discomfort and even danger when attending to their needs. For instance, the royal toilets were often perched on the edges of castles, sometimes perched above deep, dark drops where the smell of waste was only compounded by the open air. While modern plumbing and sanitation make our toilets comfortable and hygienic, for medieval kings, each visit to the privy was a reminder of just how basic their lives still were, despite their immense power. But what about their court life? How did the kings manage their royal duties while also navigating the realities of personal hygiene? Was there any form of etiquette when it came to such private matters? And how did these practices impact the royal image? For medieval kings, maintaining their royal image was not limited to matters of wealth, power, or conquest. It also extended to personal hygiene, even when it came to something as seemingly mundane as using the toilet. The etiquette of the court was deeply entwined with every aspect of royal life, and the act of toileting was no exception. In a world where public perception was everything, the way a king handled his most private moments could reflect his status and influence. Despite the less-than-ideal conditions of royal privies, kings were still expected to maintain a dignified demeanor. In some cases, the presence of servants or attendants during these private moments was not uncommon. However, it was typically a matter of discretion. The idea was not to make a spectacle of the king's bodily functions, but to ensure that his needs were met without compromising his status. The act of toileting, particularly in the presence of court attendants, became an area where the lines between privacy and public duty were blurred. While it wasn't exactly a royal spectacle, it was an important part of the royal court's routine. In some castles, the privy was even close to the king's personal chambers, allowing for a quick transition from royal duties to more personal matters. Yet, even though kings were given privacy, the presence of servants remained a sign of their status and of their need for assistance with even the most basic functions. Interestingly, in some medieval societies, the handling of bodily waste was seen as an opportunity for symbolic actions. In the French court, for example, it was not uncommon for the king to have toilet rituals observed, where his attendants would offer him various perfumes or oils to mask unpleasant smells. These gestures were more than about hygiene. They were about maintaining a sense of regal dignity. It was a way to reinforce the idea that, even in the most private moments, the king was still an elevated figure in the eyes of his subjects. Beyond these personal rituals, there were more elaborate arrangements. Some kings had private latrines attached to their chambers, complete with attendants who ensured that everything was in place for their royal needs. In some instances, the throne room itself contained a seat designed specifically for the king's use, one that provided privacy and comfort in a way that ordinary privies could not. These thrones were sometimes fitted with cushioned seats and covers to prevent any discomfort. However, not all kings had such luxuries. Castles, particularly in the more remote areas, often had rudimentary latrines located far from the royal quarters. In those cases, the king's attendants had the task of escorting him to the privy, offering a form of protection from both the elements and the possibility of intrusion. In such situations, it wasn't uncommon for the king to have a line of servants positioned along the way, ensuring that his privacy was respected and that his dignity remained intact. Despite these personal precautions, the reality was that royal toileting practices were often still messy and inefficient by today's standards. The medieval world did not have the luxury of running water or effective waste disposal systems. Toilets in castles often emptied directly into cesspits, which could pose a threat to the health of the inhabitants if left unchecked. The act of toileting, though necessary, was far from hygienic. Yet it was an accepted part of the daily routine of kings and their courts, who still sought ways to manage their bodies with the dignity and decorum expected of them. But how did all of this affect the kingdom at large? Could such a trivial matter as royal toileting have any bearing on the image of a king or the stability of his reign? What role did personal hygiene play in maintaining the authority of the monarch, particularly when it came to their relationship with their court and their people? While royal toilets may seem like a trivial aspect of medieval life, they reveal much about the relationship between the king and his subjects, and the peculiarities of medieval governance. The attention to personal hygiene, or lack thereof, speaks volumes about the perception of kingship, the symbolism of the royal body, and the growing importance of cleanliness in later periods. In many ways, royal sanitation practices reflected broader societal attitudes toward cleanliness and disease. The medieval world was plagued by a lack of understanding about germs and sanitation. Yet, ironically, the image of the king as an almost divine figure sometimes hinged on his body's cleanliness and sanctity. For monarchs, appearing clean and dignified in the public eye was integral to their ability to maintain power and control. In a society where appearances were closely tied to one's moral and political authority, even the most private matters, such as toilet habits, had an impact on how a king was perceived. However, despite their best efforts, medieval kings were still living in a world rife with disease and poor hygiene. The bubonic plague, cholera, and other epidemics frequently ravaged both the court and the peasant populations. Kings, despite their wealth and status, were just as vulnerable to these diseases as their subjects. This paradox between royal efforts to maintain dignity in personal hygiene and the overwhelming realities of unsanitary living conditions was one of the key features of medieval life. Moreover, the role of royal sanitation in the broader kingdom cannot be overlooked. Kings were often seen as protectors of their people, and their public image played a large part in this. The cleanliness of a monarch's body symbolized the purity of his reign and his divine right to rule. Yet, the image of the royal body was frequently at odds with the reality of medieval sanitation. While kings may have sought cleanliness through lavish rituals, their kingdoms were filled with unsanitary conditions that plagued ordinary people, from polluted water supplies to overcrowded living spaces. It was a stark contrast. The king's private hygiene was important, yet the general health of his people was often ignored or neglected. Over time, the royal obsession with hygiene and personal dignity began to evolve. By the Renaissance, advancements in hygiene and sanitation took hold, particularly in royal courts, which saw the establishment of dedicated bathrooms and an emphasis on cleanliness. Though royal toilets in the medieval period were far from comfortable or sanitary, the attention to these matters marked the beginning of a shift toward recognizing the importance of personal hygiene in royal and public life. Ultimately, the legacy of medieval royal sanitation practices reveals much about the medieval worldview. Despite their efforts to maintain dignity and privacy, kings were often helpless in the face of the same diseases and discomforts that plagued their subjects. The king's toilet, a seemingly trivial aspect of royal life, became a symbol of both power and vulnerability, and its legacy would influence the growing emphasis on personal hygiene and sanitation in the centuries that followed. So, as we reflect on how medieval kings managed their toilets, we must ask, how much of the symbolism surrounding royal hygiene reflects the larger cultural and societal attitudes of the time? And how did the shift toward cleaner, more sanitary practices change the monarchy's relationship with its people in the centuries to come? When we think of monasteries, images of peace, reflection, and spiritual devotion often come to mind. The monks, detached from the chaos of the outside world, living in seclusion, might seem to lead lives of profound contemplation. But the reality of monastic life was far more structured, routine-driven, and in many ways boring. Monks were bound by a strict schedule of prayers, work, and silence, all designed to bring them closer to God. While they had no need to worry about the hustle and bustle of secular life, their existence was marked by a sense of relentless routine that governed every aspect of their days. The structure of monastic life was organized around the liturgy of the hours, a series of prayers that occurred at specific times throughout the day, starting at the crack of dawn. For the monks, the day began early, often before sunrise. The first prayer, matins, was recited in the stillness of the pre-dawn hours, followed by lauds as the sun began to rise. These prayers were not simply rituals of worship, but were meant to sanctify each part of the day. The rest of the day was divided into periods of labor, meals, study, and more prayers, with the cycle continuing throughout the week, season after season. Monks would typically rise at 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on the order, to begin their prayers. After matins, they would have a period of manual labor, which was no less than an essential part of their daily life. Whether it was gardening, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or producing food and textiles, the work performed was vital not just for the monastery's self-sufficiency, but for the continued survival of the community. In many cases, this manual labor was done in silence, following the Benedictine rule, which emphasized quiet contemplation as an integral part of the monk's work. Meals, too, were highly regimented. The monastic diet was simple: plain bread, vegetables, and occasionally fish or meat. The monastery's food production often relied on the crops grown by the monks themselves. Every bite of food consumed was a reminder of the monk's role in maintaining the monastery's daily function. Monks ate in silence, reflecting on God, their work, and the meaning of their vows. The austerity of the diet matched the simplicity of their lives, a conscious choice made in devotion to humility and discipline. One of the most defining features of monastic life was its commitment to silence. The Great Silence extended throughout the night and was practiced during much of the day, except for times of prayer and communal gatherings. The silence served both spiritual and practical purposes. It was meant to cultivate an inner peace and focus on God, while also ensuring that monks could concentrate on their work and study without distraction. Silence, while seeming peaceful, often made the days long and monotonous. Communication, when necessary, was conducted through gestures or written notes. But behind this quiet devotion and simplicity was a life that was relentlessly scheduled and, for many, deeply monotonous. There were no vacations or escapes from the cycle of prayer, work, and study. The absence of external distractions made the days blend into one another. The monks knew little of the outside world, with only occasional visits from the outside for supplies or correspondence. What the outside world considered exciting or eventful, battles, politics, festivals, was, for the monk, irrelevant. Their lives were focused solely on their spiritual development and the well-being of their community. However, beneath this veneer of quiet routine, monks often struggled with the monotony of their lives. For many, the intense structure, the lack of personal freedom, and the isolation from the outside world could be stifling. The strict discipline of their order sometimes led to spiritual burnout, and many monks wrestled with feelings of doubt and disillusionment. Was their constant labor in silence truly bringing them closer to God? Or was it simply a methodical way of escaping the complexities and temptations of the world? How did these monks reconcile the desire for personal fulfillment with their commitment to a life that was marked by routine and asceticism? Was there any room for joy or individuality within the cloistered walls of the monastery? Or was life in the monastery, at its core, an exercise in self-discipline and submission? While the life of a monk might seem monotonous and repetitive, the underlying purpose of every action, the work, the prayers, the silence, was deeply spiritual. The monastic lifestyle, based on the rule of Saint Benedict, was not just a physical routine but a path to spiritual enlightenment. For many monks, this ascetic life was chosen not out of drudgery but from a deep sense of devotion to God. Yet, despite the sacred purpose, the work monks did each day was still driven by necessity. Monasteries were self-sustaining communities, and the monks were responsible for producing the food they ate, the goods they sold, and the materials they needed for religious observance. Whether it was growing grains, making bread, or brewing ale, monks were skilled craftsmen, laborers, and scholars, all in one. Their daily labor was both a form of spiritual devotion and a practical means of survival. For many, the mundane aspects of their work, milling grain, repairing the roof, or tending to the monastery gardens, were viewed as acts of humility, serving God through their labor. The craft of manuscript copying and illumination was another significant part of monastic life. Monasteries became the keepers of knowledge during the medieval period, preserving ancient texts and creating beautiful manuscripts by hand. This work, though painstaking and time-consuming, was viewed as a means of connecting with God. The copying of religious texts like the Bible, Psalms, and prayers was seen as a way to immerse oneself in divine wisdom. The act of inscribing the sacred words onto parchment, one letter at a time, was a meditative practice that intertwined the spiritual and the practical. Despite the sacredness of these tasks, they were not always a source of joy for the monks. The work was repetitive, the hours long, and the conditions sometimes harsh. The labor could take a physical toll, and many monks grew weary of their constant duties. The spiritual aspect, while ever present, often felt like a distant ideal, especially when the daily grind became overwhelming. The discipline required to maintain such a lifestyle was not always easy, and some monks found themselves questioning their vows or feeling disconnected from the very spiritual purpose that had once inspired them. But there were moments of solace, too. The monastery offered an environment where monks could find peace away from the tumult of the outside world. In some ways, the repetitive nature of their labor allowed them to disengage from the worries of daily life, offering a simple, structured routine that could lead to moments of spiritual clarity. The rituals of prayer, work, and study provided a sense of purpose, even in the midst of monotony. For many monks, this rhythm of life was a form of spiritual purification, a way to transcend worldly distractions and focus entirely on devotion to God. There were also pockets of creativity and intellectual pursuits. Many monasteries had libraries where monks could study ancient texts, philosophy, and theology. Scholars within the monastery would write theological treatises, compile histories, or engage in religious debate. The silence that defined monastic life created an ideal environment for contemplation, study, and prayer, offering opportunities for intellectual growth. For some monks, the life of study and prayer was deeply fulfilling, even if their days felt long and unchanging. Yet even within these sacred walls, not all monks were happy with their lot. The strict routines could cause inner turmoil, leading some to experience spiritual crises. The physical labor of manual work, combined with the emotional isolation, could create feelings of exhaustion or doubt. The desire for personal freedom clashed with the monastic vow of obedience. And despite their devotion, some monks wrestled with the very idea of living such an ascetic life. Was it possible to reconcile the deep longing for spiritual fulfillment with the harsh reality of their daily existence? For all the structure and discipline, the question remains: was monastic life ultimately a path to spiritual enlightenment, or was it simply a form of self-imposed confinement, a way to escape the uncertainties of the outside world by retreating into a life of routine and sacrifice? Despite the repetitive and often grueling nature of monastic life, its legacy is far-reaching, impacting not only the medieval world but shaping the future of Western civilization. The work of monks, though frequently marked by tedium, played a crucial role in the preservation and transmission of knowledge, the development of agriculture, and even the establishment of educational systems that would later influence the Renaissance. One of the most enduring legacies of monasticism is its role in preserving knowledge. During the medieval period, when libraries were few and the spread of knowledge was slow, monasteries served as vital centers of learning. Monks meticulously copied manuscripts by hand, saving texts that might otherwise have been lost to history. These monks preserved not only religious texts, but also classical works from ancient Greece and Rome, often providing the only link between the ancient world and the future. This commitment to education extended beyond manuscript copying. Many monasteries became hubs of intellectual activity, where scholars and theologians could engage in deep study and debate. The monasteries were often the only places where scientific, philosophical, and literary works could be explored. The monastic focus on intellectual pursuits would eventually lead to the establishment of the first universities in Europe, many of which were founded by or affiliated with monastic orders. These educational institutions became central to the intellectual and cultural growth of the medieval and early modern worlds. Additionally, the monastic contributions to agriculture and industry were profound. The land that monasteries controlled was often cultivated with great care, and monks pioneered new farming techniques. They developed crop rotation methods, which improved soil fertility, and they introduced new crops and animals to the regions they inhabited. The monks' dedication to manual labor was not merely an exercise in humility, but a vital part of their contribution to the broader community. They helped establish agricultural systems that would eventually lead to more efficient and productive farming practices across Europe. The monasteries also played an important role in the economy. By producing goods such as beer, wine, cheese, and textiles, monks helped sustain local economies. Many monastic orders even became wealthy from their agricultural and industrial work, which in turn enabled them to fund further religious endeavors, charitable works, and the construction of grand abbeys and churches. These economic activities gave monasteries a degree of power and influence that extended far beyond the cloistered walls. Despite all these contributions, the monastic way of life was not without its contradictions. The rigorous schedule, the emphasis on silence and discipline, and the renunciation of personal desires could be alienating, even for the most devout monk. And while monastic communities preserved knowledge and contributed to the greater good, they also sometimes became centers of political power, entangled in the same power struggles that defined secular society. The wealth accumulated by monasteries led to corruption and scandals in certain instances, and the strict hierarchy of the monasteries could lead to abuses of power and mistreatment of lower-ranking monks. Yet, despite these shortcomings, the fundamental essence of monastic life remained a testament to devotion, discipline, and community. Even in the most boring, routine-driven parts of the monks' lives, they were building a foundation for the future. The legacy of their quiet work, done in silence and obscurity, would go on to shape the course of Western civilization. The monasteries, through their isolation and focus on the sacred, were able to bridge the gap between the ancient and medieval worlds, ensuring that knowledge and culture were preserved during a time when Europe was engulfed in chaos and instability. So, as we reflect on the seemingly boring details of monastic life, we realize that these small, seemingly insignificant acts of labor and devotion were instrumental in shaping not only medieval society, but the future of the world. The monks' dedication to preserving knowledge, cultivating the land, and maintaining spiritual discipline left a legacy that would continue to influence generations long after the last bell tolled for the cloistered monks. When we think of groundbreaking inventions, we often imagine grand, world-changing ideas. The printing press, electricity, the steam engine. But some of the most important innovations in history have been humble, everyday tools, none more so than the plow. Though it may not have the glamour of modern technology, the invention of the plow revolutionized agriculture, changing the course of human history in ways that are still felt today. The plow is as old as civilization itself. Its roots stretch back to the early agricultural societies of the Neolithic era, where humans first began to settle and cultivate the land. Prior to the plow, early farmers relied on simple digging tools and hand tools to work the soil. These methods were labor-intensive and limited in their effectiveness. As populations grew and farming became more necessary to sustain larger societies, the need for more efficient tools became clear. The earliest forms of the plow were nothing more than simple wooden frames with a sharp edge, pulled by humans or animals. These early plows, often called ard plows, were used to break up the soil, making it easier to plant seeds. However, they were rudimentary and inefficient, leaving much of the land untended or poorly tilled. The development of a more effective plow was a gradual process that involved trial, error, and innovation. As early as 3000 BCE, civilizations in the ancient Near East began to experiment with more advanced versions of the plow. The Sumerians, for example, developed a plow that was drawn by oxen, allowing them to till larger fields more quickly and efficiently. This was a crucial development. By harnessing the power of animals, farmers could break up the soil with much less effort than they could with human labor alone. This innovation greatly increased agricultural productivity and allowed for the cultivation of larger areas of land, supporting larger populations and the growth of cities. The real breakthrough in plow technology came with the addition of the iron blade. Early plows used wooden or stone blades, which were not durable enough to break through tough soil. The introduction of iron in the 5th century BCE transformed the plow, allowing it to penetrate even the hardest earth. The Iron Age marked a turning point for agriculture, and the improved plow was central to this shift. But what made the plow so revolutionary was not just the material it was made from, but the way it reshaped entire societies. As farming became more efficient, people were able to produce more food, which led to population growth. Larger populations required more infrastructure, more goods, and more specialized labor. The plow helped lay the groundwork for the rise of cities and complex civilizations. Yet, despite its profound impact, the plow itself was a tool that most people took for granted. It was just part of the everyday grind of agricultural life. So, while the invention of the plow was monumental in its impact, it was, by all accounts, a simple and unremarkable tool in the eyes of those who used it. Its true significance wasn't realized until much later. But as we look back, we must ask, how did such a simple, unassuming tool manage to transform the entire course of human history? While the invention of the plow might seem like a straightforward advancement in farming technology, its influence was far-reaching, affecting not just the agricultural sector, but the very structure of human societies. The introduction of more efficient plowing techniques didn't just increase food production. It also reshaped social and economic systems, influenced the development of cities, and even helped lay the foundations for the modern world. For millennia, agriculture had been a back-breaking and time-consuming activity. Farmers worked the soil by hand, or with simple tools like hoes and digging sticks, which severely limited the amount of land that could be farmed and the efficiency of the process. However, the introduction of the plow, particularly with the addition of animal power and later, iron blades, changed everything. With the ability to plow more land more quickly, farmers could produce more food in less time, creating surpluses that could support larger populations. This increase in food production had immediate effects on population growth. With more food available, communities could sustain larger families, leading to the growth of settlements and the eventual development of cities. These cities became centers of commerce, trade, and culture, as the surplus food produced by agriculture allowed for specialization. Not everyone needed to be involved in food production anymore, which meant people could focus on other tasks, crafting goods, building structures, and engaging in intellectual and artistic pursuits. The plow also contributed to the rise of trade networks. As food production became more efficient and surplus crops became common, merchants were able to transport and sell goods to neighboring regions. This expanded trade led to greater cultural exchanges, the movement of goods across long distances, and the development of more complex economies. Communities could now exchange food for other resources, which supported the growth of industries such as textiles, pottery, and metalworking. In addition to the economic benefits, the plow also had significant social implications. The increase in agricultural productivity meant that land became more valuable, and land ownership began to be seen as a source of wealth and power. This shift led to the development of feudal systems, where landowners held significant power over those who worked the land. In medieval Europe, for example, lords and vassals were able to extract labor from peasants, who were bound to the land in a system that mirrored the agricultural needs of the time. The plow, by enabling large-scale farming, helped to reinforce this hierarchical structure. However, the plow was not without its drawbacks. Although it made farming more efficient, it also contributed to environmental changes. The widespread use of plows led to the clearing of forests and the draining of wetlands, both of which impacted the natural landscape. Over time, intensive plowing could deplete the soil, leading to erosion and other environmental challenges. The plow, while boosting agricultural production, also set in motion some of the environmental issues we face today. In the grand scheme of history, the plow is an uncelebrated hero. It revolutionized agriculture in ways that went unnoticed by most, and its impact was felt across cultures, economies, and societies. Yet, for all its transformative power, the plow remained a simple, utilitarian tool. It didn't capture the imagination the way other inventions did, like the printing press or the wheel, but its role in human history cannot be understated. Without the plow, civilization as we know it may never have emerged. It was the silent engine driving the growth of cities, the expansion of trade, and the development of complex societies. As we look back on this unremarkable tool, we have to wonder, how many other simple inventions, now forgotten or taken for granted, shaped the world we live in today? And how many of them, like the plow, have had an impact far greater than we could ever fully appreciate in their time. The plow's legacy stretches far beyond the fields it tilled and the crops it helped cultivate. While it may have started as a simple tool to make agriculture more efficient, it laid the foundation for the modern world. As agriculture advanced, so did the way we produced food, and as food production increased, so did the complexity of human societies. The plow, though unassuming in appearance and humble in its function, was the catalyst for transformations that reshaped economies, power structures, and the relationship between humans and their environment. The plow didn't just contribute to the rise of civilizations, it helped establish the very idea of progress. In the centuries following its invention, as plowing techniques improved, so did crop yields, enabling societies to support larger populations. This surplus of food was essential for the development of towns and cities, which, in turn, led to the creation of governments, trade, and industry. The plow was a quiet but essential part of this cycle, allowing human beings to settle and thrive in larger, more organized communities rather than living as scattered nomads. Even as societies moved toward industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries, the plow remained central to agricultural work. While the tools and methods evolved, the concept of plowing remained largely unchanged until the advent of mechanized tractors. The horse-drawn plow gradually gave way to more powerful and efficient machines, such as the steam-powered plow and eventually the modern tractor. These innovations allowed farmers to till larger areas of land more quickly, further increasing the efficiency of food production. But the plow's impact goes beyond the confines of agriculture. The environmental changes brought about by widespread plowing, clearing forests, draining wetlands, and cultivating vast expanses of land, shaped the world's landscapes in profound ways. The plow, for all its efficiency, contributed to the development of agricultural systems that continue to dominate the global economy. Modern farming practices, for all their technological advances, still rely on the basic principles of plowing and tilling the land to create the crops that feed billions of people. Today, the plow is often relegated to museums, a symbol of a bygone era, yet its legacy is woven into the fabric of modern life, from the food on our tables to the cities we live in. Every modern agricultural tool, every crop harvested, and every piece of land cultivated bears the mark of the plow's influence. In examining the plow, we are reminded of how seemingly small, simple innovations can have a profound and lasting impact on society. The plow did not only change the way we farmed, it helped shape the course of history, driving the development of civilizations, altering economies, and transforming landscapes. It was a tool of transformation, both mundane and extraordinary in its impact. So, as we reflect on the humble plow, we must ask, how many other inventions, both grand and seemingly insignificant, have shaped the world in ways we might never fully understand? And what other quiet revolutions are yet to come, changing the course of history in ways we cannot yet foresee? The Knights Templar are among the most fascinating and enigmatic organizations in history, shrouded in mystery and intrigue. Often remembered as brave warriors, protectors of Christian pilgrims, and holders of secret knowledge. The story of the Templars is one of both grandeur and tragic downfall. But the true origins of the Templars are far more mundane and grounded in the realities of medieval Europe. The Order of the Knights Templar was founded in 1119 during the Crusades by a group of French knights led by Hugues de Payens. Initially, their purpose was simple: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. At the time, Jerusalem had been captured during the First Crusade, and many pilgrims made the dangerous journey to the Holy Land, risking their lives against bandits, hostile forces, and the harsh terrain. The Templars offered them protection, traveling with them as a kind of military escort. The order was officially sanctioned by the Catholic Church in 1129, receiving the support of Pope Honorius II. With this recognition, the Templars gained both legitimacy and protection. They became a military order with their own set of rules, rituals, and vows, and were granted the ability to raise funds and recruit members from across Europe. The order's role, however, was not limited to protecting pilgrims. They quickly became involved in the defense of the Crusader states in the Holy Land, acting as elite warriors in the ongoing crusades against Muslim forces. Over time, the Templars grew in both power and influence. Their wealth and holdings expanded dramatically, with donations pouring in from noble families across Europe, eager to support the religious cause. They established a vast network of castles, estates, and estates across Europe and the Holy Land, building their reputation as not only fearsome warriors but also shrewd businessmen. The Templars were among the first to set up an early banking system, offering protection for funds, facilitating money transfers, and issuing letters of credit. This financial expertise made them an invaluable part of European commerce. Despite their wealth and success, the Templars were not without enemies. Their growing power and influence began to raise suspicion among both secular rulers and the Church, and it wasn't long before the Templars' wealth would lead to their downfall. But what was it about the Templars that made them so feared and admired? Was it their ability to fight in the Crusades, their secretive rituals, or their astounding wealth that eventually led to their demise? As the Templars' influence spread across Europe, so did the rumors and suspicions surrounding their activities. While they were admired by some for their devotion and military prowess, others began to view them with growing unease. The wealth they amassed and their autonomy, essentially operating like a state within a state, raised concerns among both kings and popes. Their military success, particularly during the Crusades, enhanced their reputation. The Templars were instrumental in many key battles, and their knights were feared for their discipline, bravery, and the sacred mission they represented. Their distinctive white mantles adorned with a red cross became a symbol of both martial valor and religious devotion. But as their military and financial power grew, so did envy and resentment, particularly from secular rulers. The Templars' vast network of properties, estates, and holdings made them immensely wealthy. They controlled vast swaths of land and were involved in a variety of businesses, from banking to agricultural production. This gave them significant economic influence, which threatened the established powers of the time, especially monarchs who found themselves dependent on the Templars for financing their wars and campaigns. One of the most pivotal moments in the Templars' history occurred in 1307. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars and motivated by his desire to seize their wealth, began a campaign to dismantle the order. Philip was also driven by suspicion and fear of the Templars' influence in France. On Friday, October 13, 1307, he ordered the arrest of all Templars in France, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and other crimes. Many were tortured into confessing to false charges, and those who resisted faced brutal executions. In addition to the charges of heresy, the Templars were accused of practicing secret rituals, including the worship of idols and the denial of Christ. These accusations, fueled by both political and religious motivations, painted the order as a shadowy and dangerous force. King Philip's charges were exaggerated, but they were enough to give him the legal and political leverage needed to dismantle the order and seize their vast wealth. Despite King Philip's campaign, the Templars fought to defend their honor. Pope Clement V, who had initially shown support for the Templars, hesitated to take action against them. However, under pressure from King Philip, he eventually issued a papal bull in 1312 that officially dissolved the order. The Templars were stripped of their assets, and many of their leaders were burned at the stake. Their lands and properties were absorbed by other orders, and the surviving members were forced into hiding or became part of other religious groups. But the legacy of the Templars did not end with their official dissolution. While their formal existence as an order was erased, many myths and legends grew around them. The Templars, supposed secret knowledge, hidden treasures, and mysterious rituals became fodder for conspiracy theories and speculation. Some believed that the Templars had hidden their wealth, and even today, there are stories of hidden treasure and ancient secrets that continue to fuel fascination with the order. The question remains: did the Templars truly possess secret knowledge, or was their fall simply the result of political maneuvering and royal greed? And how did the myths surrounding them contribute to their lasting impact on history and culture? While the official dissolution of the Knights Templar was swift and brutal, their influence and the myths surrounding them have endured for centuries. The mystery of their sudden downfall, the dramatic trials of their leaders, and the supposed treasure they hid have fueled a captivating mythology that has been passed down through history. Even today, the Templars remain the subject of intrigue, conspiracy theories, and speculation. One of the most enduring myths surrounding the Templars is their alleged secret treasure. Rumors that the Templars had hidden vast amounts of wealth before their fall have persisted for centuries. Some suggest that the Templars accumulated great riches during their time in the Holy Land, and when their order was disbanded, they managed to conceal this wealth in secret locations. According to legend, the treasure might include sacred relics, such as the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant, objects of immense spiritual significance that would be valuable not just in terms of wealth, but in religious power. Though no tangible evidence has ever been found, these theories have been popularized by books, movies, and documentaries, fueling the idea that the Templars were more than just a military order. They were the custodians of an ancient secret. Beyond the treasure, the Templars have been credited with possessing secret knowledge and a hidden agenda. Their rituals, their complex hierarchy, and their strong code of conduct have inspired numerous theories about what the Templars truly believed and practiced behind closed doors. Some claim that the Templars were part of an ancient tradition of esoteric knowledge, perhaps connected to early forms of Freemasonry, or that they were guardians of hidden, divine wisdom. This belief in secret knowledge is further bolstered by the fact that the Templars were a deeply mystical order, drawing inspiration from both Christianity and elements of older traditions. The myths surrounding the Templars were not just concocted by conspiracy theorists. During the medieval period, as rumors about their secretive practices spread, they were often linked to accusations of heresy. The fact that their wealth and power seemed to operate outside the control of the church and secular rulers made them easy targets for suspicion. In addition to the allegations of idolatry and heresy made during their trials, there were whispers of their involvement in occult practices, further contributing to their air of mystery and intrigue. In modern times, the Templars have become a symbol of mystery and rebellion. In popular culture, they are often portrayed as part of an ongoing battle against corrupt forces, holding knowledge and secrets that the world's elite would do anything to control. This portrayal is reflected in countless novels, films, and television shows, where the Templars are depicted as guardians of hidden knowledge, or as the originators of secret societies that operate in the shadows of history. Yet, the reality of the Templars was much more grounded in the political and religious tensions of their time. While they were certainly a powerful and influential military order, their downfall was less about hidden treasures and occult practices, and more about the conflicts between secular rulers and the church. King Philip IV's desire to consolidate power and seize the Templars' wealth was a primary motivator in their destruction. The order's dissolution was more about politics, greed, and the shifting tides of power than it was about secret societies and hidden treasures. So, what is the true legacy of the Templars? Was their impact really as dramatic and mystical as the myths suggest? Or was it simply the result of an ancient organization's attempt to survive in a rapidly changing world? While their military prowess and wealth might have come to an end, the fascination with the Templars remains alive in our imaginations. Their story, full of grandeur, intrigue, and mystery, continues to captivate us, shaping our perceptions of medieval history and the secrets that lie hidden in the shadows of time.